Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stella Choi, and I'm doing a PhD with the School of Education in Trinity College, Dublin. Today, I'm going to summarize my learnings from ERAM, a 5-day intensive program, and summarize it into a 10 minutes presentation about how to communicate to journalists or media so that it's easy enough for the public to understand your research, but at the same time, it's complex enough to reflect your scope of the research. So I will be covering 3 main points. First is about the fake news and ethics. The second is 3 tips about effective communication to journalists. Number 3 is the news values. And finally, we will finish with a Q&A section. So if you have any questions, please hold them until the end of of my presentation. So what is your lemonade? It could be presentation in conference, publish a paper, or interviewed by a journalist. But before you get there, there are fake news because of the exponential increase in COVID-19 articles, but bypass peer review and directly go to the media and the public. The problematic COVID-19 articles have 50% rejected rate around the world, and 30% of the topics of COVID were rejected in Greece. So the high rates of rejections on COVID-19 research make us think about our roles on the fake news. So the ethics, as mentioned by Professor Ann David, is very worth considering. And I will also include a video by Professor Alan Kelly in UCC, who covered the topic in a seminar, which is very good. I will type it in the chat. So in the ERAM, I learned with 20 other journalists and researchers in 7 European countries with input about what topics that needs to be considered in an effective science communication. So I like to highlight 4 main areas. One is to use visual, and the second is to use simple language, and the third is to have multiple views and to provide evidence. Now I'm going to move to the 3 tips. Number 1 is simple language. I will also type in the menti.com in the chat so that at the end of the section we can also have an output about reminders about what we should consider in communicating your research to journalists. So I cooperated with 2 other journalists and researchers, and we've discussed about my topic of research and choose the language. For example, my research topic is about children's well-being and more specifically anxiety in children. So we chose to use the language that is respectful and understandable. And we agree that we should avoid using symptoms because the word symptom is restricted to the medical perspective. Instead, we should use signs. Again, we should avoid use causes because correlation is not causation, and we should use precursors or risk factors. Finally, we should avoid using illness or sickness to describe anxiety because, again, of the medical perspective and of the possible stigma. And now we've chosen to use children with anxiety. I like the quote, which is using simple language or metaphor or analogy to represent your complex research. I like it. A famous quote, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. This principle also applies to early intervention. Now we've come to the second tip. It's about use of visuals and figures. As you can see from my presentation, I already use figures and visuals, and people most likely to like figures and some visual that can explain a lot of things. So the journalists are very good. They chose some pictures or illustration that is very very useful to represent the abstract concept of anxiety in children. So they find this one as a signs of anxiety in children. So I think these visuals are very important and useful because maybe you can also identify with some signs of anxiety by looking at the picture. For example, difficulty getting to sleep and difficulty concentrating. I also have this problem. And also having some somatic problems such as stomachache or headaches. So the visuals is very good to let others understand more about your research. And I also take into that consideration using some visuals. For example, I include 9 pictures of the Lego play that is 3 children do collaborative play and using freestyle in one session, and one picture represents one one product that they made in the section. And I like the picture because every picture has the fingers of the children, and they are participating in the sessions. And I also use some diagram to represent the theory. For example, this diagram is to put the child at the center, and also the researcher is at the center. Another visual I use is I've taken photos of one hand holding 5 different colors of leaves and with different shapes to represent the theory of universal design for learning. And I made the caption different but the same. Number 3, the tips is about storytelling. So when you are telling the story, telling your research as a story is very very understandable and very interesting to the public. So I discussed with my colleagues and then agree that we use the frame of positive and optimistic frame, and using the angle of anxiety is not a disease, but it could be managed by all of us. And I also include some recent news that is related. So you can also consider storytelling in this way. Finally, we will come to the 7 news value and your research. I learned from the program that if your research is related to this news value, your research is more likely to be covered. And the news values are impact, timeliness, and prominence. That means if the news is about important or famous people, is more likely to be covered. And proximity, bizarreness, conflict, and currency. That is, if the news is about public concern, it is more likely to be covered. And I learned from the program that some topics may not be popular years ago. For example, no one knows about anxiety in Ireland 5 years ago, as I talked to the CEO of Buddy Bench. But with communication, people are more aware of well-being in children. And also, like research in climate change, the trend is changing. And you can be the one to make the change. And I will include about an article about top tips for researchers about media interviews. So the top 1 tip is to ask about the deadline for if the journalist invited you for any kind of interviews or coverage. And the first tips is to ask when is the deadline, and you can, because time is of very importance to the journalists. So in summary, I've covered your role in fake news and ethics, and 3 tips about effective communication to journalists, and 7 news values. I hope that give you some kind of insights about how to communicate your research, and I will invite you to participate in the Menti.com, and that is to have 3 reminders about communicating your research to journalists. And that will be our output, and I may cover it in the Q&A section. So now if you have any questions, please type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask directly. Thank you for listening.